Don't look so disappointed, my mother said, not even lowering her voice. You didn't earn anything this year anyway. She said it like a correction, like fixing grammar. My father didn't look up. He kept cutting his food, slow and neat, as if the sentence hadn't landed directly on me. As if this was already settled. The room was dimmer than it should have been for a celebration. One overhead light, yellowed. Everyone else sat closer to it. I was at the corner of the table where the light thinned out and the shadows stacked. My place setting was still full, untouched. The glass sweating against my palm. Across from me, the box slid open. Velvet. The soft click was louder than the music. Diamonds caught the light and threw it back at the walls. Someone laughed. Not at me, past me. I felt my breath stall halfway in. Just for a second. Like my body had hit a wall it didn't expect. My hands started to shake. Not dramatically, just enough that the fork ticked once against the plate. I tightened my grip until the metal went still. There was a bottle in my bag under the chair. The label peeled at one corner. I'd forgotten to take it earlier. I could picture it perfectly. White plastic, child-proof cap, the faint rattle when you tilt it. The image came uninvited and sat there. My mother glanced at me again, annoyed now. Don't make a face, she added. It's embarrassing. That did it. That was the line that tried to make me small. I swallowed, straightened my back, let my shoulders settle where they belonged. The shaking stopped. I set the fork down carefully, parallel to the plate, like I'd been taught. No one asked if I was okay. No one needed to. The decision had already been made, and it wasn't mine. I nodded once. A small movement. Agreement shaped. Silence shaped. The music kept playing. Glasses clinked. Someone toasted family without irony. I tasted copper at the back of my mouth and ignored it. I didn't explain. I didn't defend myself. I didn't leave. I stayed. I watched who was watching. I noticed which servers paused and which didn't. I saw the manager glance over when the laughter spiked too sharply, then look away. This wasn't ending here. I knew that as clearly as I knew my own name. Some moments don't explode. They harden. And once they do, everything after is just pressure finding the crack. That night didn't finish at the table. It followed me out through the glass doors into the parking lot where the air was cold and smelled like damp concrete. It stayed with me in the back seat of the ride home, where no one spoke, and the city slid by in reflections. It sat quietly while keys were dropped into a bowl, shoes lined up, lights turned off one by one. This was not over. But it was not going to be loud. I didn't confront anyone. Not then. Not later that night. I didn't replay the words out loud or ask for them to be taken back. I let them sit exactly where they were said, unchanged. Words age differently when you don't interfere with them. In my room, I placed my bag on the chair instead of the floor. Small order, restored. I took the bottle out, twisted the cap, set it beside a glass of water. I didn't rush. I didn't delay. The rattle was softer than I remembered. Down the hall, laughter flared and faded. A door closed. Someone hummed. Life continued with the confidence of people who believed nothing had shifted. That was the mistake. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I wasn't building a case in my head or rehearsing a speech for later. I wasn't planning a scene. Scenes burn out quickly. They leave ash and denial. This would last longer than that. The truth has a way of surfacing without being summoned. It leaks through routines. It shows up in records, in habits, in the things people assume no one is watching. You don't need to chase it. You just need to stop covering for it. So I did nothing that could be called retaliation. I didn't withdraw. I didn't escalate. I stayed exactly where I was meant to be and let time do what it does best: apply pressure evenly. Restraint looks passive to people who confuse noise with power. It isn't. It's simply quieter. Days passed. Normal days. Meals. Messages. Obligations met without commentary. I spoke when spoken to. I answered questions without adding anything extra. I kept my tone level. I kept my calendar full. Stability is disarming when someone expects collapse. No one noticed the change right away. That's the other thing about restraint. It doesn't announce itself. It rearranges the balance slowly until the old assumptions no longer hold. I paid attention, not obsessively, precisely. I noted what was said casually and what was avoided. I noticed which stories stayed consistent and which required revision. I noticed who looked relieved by my silence and who looked unsettled by it. Still, I said nothing, because this wasn't about proving pain. Pain is easy to dismiss. This was about letting the facts stand without commentary, letting them be encountered rather than argued. The reckoning would not arrive as a confrontation. It would arrive as recognition. At a time that made denial impossible. In a setting that didn't belong to me alone. I didn't need to force it. Some outcomes don't respond to anger. They respond to patience. I didn't need to convince anyone I was reliable. I already was. I showed up when I said I would. Early, if anything. I kept receipts folded flat and paid my share without comment. When something broke, I fixed it, or arranged for it to be fixed. When plans changed, I adjusted. When there was confusion, I clarified it quietly and moved on. There was no scoreboard, no expectation of credit. If someone forgot an appointment, I rescheduled it. If a bill came in higher than expected, I covered the difference and noted it for later. When a relative needed a ride, I drove. When a form needed filling out, I filled it out correctly the first time. When silence was required, I stayed silent. None of this was sacrifice. It was baseline. At family gatherings, I took the edge seat and refilled glasses without being asked. I listened more than I spoke. I didn't correct stories even when I was being edited out of them. I let jokes pass if they weren't aimed to wound. I didn't need to be centered to belong. I didn't ask for special treatment. I didn't expect praise. I didn't negotiate affection. That's important. Because what happened didn't come from provocation. There was no argument beforehand, no raised voice, no refusal, no mistake that needed punishing. The remark at the table didn't follow tension. It arrived clean, dropped, untethered from cause. Disproportion is easiest to see when nothing precedes it. In the weeks before, I'd done what I always did. Paid a late fee no one else noticed. Replaced a light bulb that wasn't mine. Covered a dinner bill when someone's card declined and pretended not to notice the relief. Fixed a scheduling error quietly so no one would be embarrassed by it. I didn't bring it up later. I never do. There's a particular discipline in not reminding people what you've done for them. It keeps the facts intact. It prevents revision. The treatment, when it came, didn't match the behavior. It couldn't. That mismatch is the point. I wasn't trying to earn favor. I assumed neutrality. That was the contract I thought we were all operating under. Do your part, expect nothing extra, avoid harm. What I received wasn't neutral, it was corrective. As if something needed to be put back in its place. After the dinner, nothing changed in my conduct. That mattered too. I didn't withdraw support. I didn't withhold effort. I didn't begin tallying debts or rehearsing grievances. I kept showing up with the same consistency, the same tone, the same boundaries. Reliability doesn't fluctuate to make a point. People often mistake endurance for consent. They assume continuity means agreement. It doesn't. It just means the person enduring isn't interested in chaos. I noticed how quickly the story adjusted around me, how the remark became a joke, how the discomfort shifted away from the words themselves and onto my reaction to them, how the absence of retaliation was interpreted as softness. I let those interpretations stand. They weren't mine to manage. What matters is this: nothing I did invited what happened. Nothing I withheld caused it. There was no debt unpaid, no expectation unmet, no warning ignored. The harm didn't come from conflict. It came from entitlement. That distinction matters later, when the facts are laid out without commentary, and people try to locate the moment things went wrong. They won't find it in my behavior. They'll find it in the assumption that someone who asks for nothing can be given less. And that assumption, once exposed, doesn't argue back. It didn't continue as an argument. It continued as logistics. That's how it always does. The first thing to change was the tone of the jokes. Not sharper, more reasonable, delivered with a smile that suggested concern rather than contempt. "You're very sensitive," my mother said once, lightly, as if offering medical information. "That's not a bad thing, just something to be aware of." I nodded. Awareness didn't require agreement. Another time, my father laughed and said, "You take things too seriously. We're just being honest." He said honest the way people say healthy when they mean unpleasant. The jokes were never repeated verbatim. They shifted just enough to avoid being pinned down. That was part of their design. At a family lunch, someone mentioned a trip planned for the following weekend. I hadn't heard about it. My name wasn't used. The destination was. I asked about the dates. Neutral. My sister checked her phone and said, "Oh, we assumed you'd be busy." No one asked if I was. The assumption was treated as considerate, efficient. It saved everyone time. Later, I found out the reservation had been made weeks earlier, and there had been time to ask. Plenty of it. At holidays, the gifts changed shape. Not worse, more instructive. A planner, unwrapped carefully. "So you can organize yourself better," my mother said. She smiled as if this were generosity with a lesson attached. Inside, the pages were already dated. My birthday circled in pen. A book about communication. "Thought you might like this," my father added. He tapped the cover. "You're quiet. Might help." I said thank you. I always did. Once, it was a sweater. 2 sizes too small. "They didn't have your size," my sister said quickly. "But it was on sale." The receipt wasn't included. At dinner, seating became fluid. No announcement. Just small adjustments. I arrived to find my usual place occupied. I moved without comment. Someone joked about musical chairs. Laughter followed, brief and contained. When I spoke, there was a half-second delay before anyone responded. Not silence, processing, as if my words needed to be evaluated for relevance before being allowed into the room. Sometimes they weren't responded to at all. The conversation simply stepped around them. When I didn't laugh at a joke, my mother's expression tightened. "You always do that," she said once. "You make things awkward." I hadn't said anything. I learned which subjects were heavy when I mentioned them and interesting when someone else did. I learned which plans I was told about after they were finalized. I learned how often my absence was framed as convenience. "You don't really like crowds," my father said when I asked why I hadn't been invited. I hadn't said that. But it was plausible enough to stand. Each moment, alone, was defensible. That's the trick. At work events, family members would ask about my schedule in front of others, already knowing the answer. "Oh, right, you're busy," they'd say before I could respond. The narrative arrived fully formed. All I had to do was step into it or correct it publicly. I chose neither. At birthdays, the messages were polite and brief. No call, no follow-up. At someone else's birthday, I was reminded to contribute early. Just to be fair, my mother said. Fairness always moved in one direction. Once, I was asked to help with paperwork. Forms, signatures, deadlines. I completed everything the same day and sent it back. There was no acknowledgement. 2 weeks later, my father mentioned how stressful it had been handling it all alone. I didn't interrupt. Another time. Not I was told not to worry about attending a gathering because it would be boring for you. The word for you did a lot of work. It sounded considerate. It wasn't. When I did attend, there was often a comment afterward. You seemed distant. Or, you weren't very engaged. The critique arrived regardless of effort. It didn't respond to behavior. It replaced it. I noticed how often concern was used as cover. We just want what's best for you. We're worried about you. This is coming from love. Those phrases ended conversations. They weren't invitations to respond. They were closures. Once, after a comment landed poorly, my mother sighed and said, I can't say anything around you anymore. The burden shifted instantly. The harm became my reaction to it. I apologized. The apology didn't fix anything, but it preserved the atmosphere. And that was its function. Over time, the exclusions became procedural. Group chats that I wasn't in. Decisions made before I was informed. Photos shared afterward. Always afterward. When I asked about it, the answers were calm. It just happened. It was last minute. We didn't think you'd mind. I learned that didn't think was another way of saying didn't check. At meals, my portion was served last. No one rushed. The food was still warm. That wasn't the point. The order was. When there was praise, it was comparative. You're the responsible one, my father said once. Unlike some people, he didn't look at me when he said it. Responsibility was treated like a utility, not a trait. When there was criticism, it was generalized. You've been different lately. Different from what wasn't specified. The statement hovered, I waiting for me to define it. I didn't. The pattern didn't announce itself. It accumulated. Each moment small enough to explain away. Each explanation reasonable enough to accept. Together, they formed something heavier than any single incident. I never named it. Naming invites debate. Instead, I paid attention to the rhythm, the consistency, the way comfort was withdrawn and reintroduced conditionally, the way my presence was tolerated but not centered, useful but not defended. Still, I didn't react. That's what made it sustainable. People assume cruelty escalates through volume. Sometimes it escalates through repetition, through calm delivery, through the confidence that nothing will be challenged. The anger didn't arrive all at once. It came in increments, a tightening, a recognition, not outrage, clarity. Because once you see the pattern, you stop asking why each piece exists. You start asking how long it's been there. And once you ask that, the end is already moving toward you. There was someone else in the room most of those times, not seated at the table, not part of the conversation, present in the way fixtures are present, useful, unnoticed, assumed neutral. At the restaurant, it was the manager who passed by twice more than necessary. He didn't slow down, didn't look directly at us, just adjusted a place setting that didn't need adjusting. Once, he paused long enough to hear the end of a sentence, then kept moving. At home, it was the accountant my father liked to call overly thorough, a woman with square glasses and a notebook that never closed. She asked questions that sounded procedural and wrote down the answers without reacting to them. When she was finished, she thanked everyone and left exactly on time. At a family event, it was a cousin's partner. New enough to be quiet, old enough to know better than to interrupt. He stood near the door, phone face down in his hand, listening more than he scrolled. When laughter rose too quickly, his eyes flicked up, then back down. None of them said anything. That's what made them credible. They didn't lean toward me. They didn't offer sympathy or signal alliance. They didn't exchange looks or raise eyebrows. They occupied the neutral ground that people mistake for absence. But neutrality is still a position. Once, after a comment landed and the table went briefly still, the server returned with the check earlier than expected. She set it down, centered, and said nothing. Her pen rested beside it, unused. She waited. Another time, the accountant asked for a document I hadn't been told about. The room shifted. A pause. Someone said it would be sent later. She nodded and wrote that down too. No reaction. Just ink. At a small gathering, the cousin's partner asked a practical question. Dates, names, times. He didn't press. He just asked it clearly enough that everyone heard it. When the answer changed mid-sentence, he didn't correct it. He didn't need to. The moment passed. The record didn't. These people weren't on my side. Not yet. They weren't against anyone either. And they were simply present where assumptions were being made out loud. That mattered. Because when stories are told privately, they stay flexible. When they're told in shared space, they harden. I noticed how often my parents adjusted their tone when certain people were nearby, how jokes became gentler, how comments were trimmed at the edges, how decisions were framed more carefully. Control behaves differently when it's observed. Still, nothing happened. No one stepped in. No one corrected the record. No one defended me. Good. Intervention would have collapsed the pattern too early. It would have offered an excuse, a misunderstanding, a chance to retreat into apology without consequence. Instead, the moments were allowed to land, to exist unchallenged, to be seen. The ally wasn't a person yet, not in the way people think of allies, and it was proximity, it was memory. It was the simple fact that not everything said disappears, and that was enough for now. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't warn them. I didn't explain myself. I continued exactly as expected. I showed up on time. I answered messages with neutral brevity. I attended the dinners I was invited to and declined the ones I wasn't without comment. When asked for help, I agreed. When thanked, I nodded. When overlooked, I adjusted. Nothing about my behavior suggested resistance. That was the point. Compliance is disarming when it isn't resentful. It creates a false sense of resolution. People relax around it. They stop monitoring themselves. So I let them. I started keeping track of things the way you do when you're not trying to build a case. Just a record. Dates written in the margins of old notebooks. Screenshots saved without labels. Receipts folded and slipped into an envelope that stayed in the bottom drawer. No system that looked like a system. I didn't journal feelings. I didn't annotate motives. I recorded facts. Who said what? Who was present? What was promised? What changed? When someone repeated a story differently than before, I noted the difference. When a decision was framed as mutual that hadn't been discussed, I wrote down the phrasing. When responsibility shifted quietly from one person to another, I kept the message thread. I didn't check these notes often. That would have made them feel important. They weren't. They were insurance. Timing mattered more than speed. If you move too early, you force coherence. People close ranks. They clean up language. They get careful. Carelessness only appears when people believe the moment has passed. So I waited. In the meantime, I did what I'd always done. Paid quietly, fixed what needed fixing, took on tasks that no one wanted to be responsible for. When things went smoothly, the credit dispersed. When something went wrong, the blame looked for a place to land. I let it. I didn't defend myself when a miscommunication was attributed to me. I corrected the detail once, calmly, then stopped. Repetition creates friction. Silence creates assumptions. They assumed I didn't notice. They assumed I wouldn't remember. They assumed wrong. As months passed, the tone shifted again. Not kinder, just looser. Jokes sharpened. Comments landed harder. Decisions were made faster, with less explanation. The presence of observers no longer moderated behavior the way it once had. Familiarity breeds confidence. Confidence breeds mistakes. Someone forwarded an email they meant to summarize. Someone mentioned a conversation that hadn't happened. Someone joked about handling me, then laughed when no one objected. I didn't react. At gatherings, I noticed how often my absence was planned around. "You won't need to worry about that," my mother said once, too quickly. "We've got it covered." Covered meant controlled. I thanked her. The more I stayed calm, the more narrative control they felt they had. They filled in my silence with their own interpretations. Fragile. Oblivious. Passive. It made them generous with details. A comment here. A slip there. A casual admission framed as humor. "You know how we are," my father said once, waving a hand. "We just decide things." Decide things for whom wasn't specified. It didn't need to be. I kept the text. The power wasn't in any single piece of information. It was in accumulation, in the way small facts, lined up, stop looking small. Still, I didn't change my posture. I didn't grow colder. I didn't grow warmer. I stayed consistent. That consistency became its own contrast. When I was asked to confirm something, I did it in writing. When plans were discussed verbally, I followed up with a brief message, just to make sure I understood. Polite, efficient, no accusations, no edge. Paper trails don't argue, they just exist. As they grew more comfortable, and they grew less precise. Timelines blurred, stories simplified, responsibility shifted depending on who was listening. I noticed how often my name was used to stabilize things. "They're fine with it. They agreed. They don't mind." I didn't correct these statements publicly. That would have forced confrontation. Instead, I stopped reinforcing them privately. When asked directly, I answered clearly. "That wasn't my understanding." Or, "I wasn't consulted on that." No emotion, just fact. The room would go quiet for a beat, then move on. Those beats added up. I could feel the balance changing, not outwardly, but underneath. Like a structure with one support removed. Still standing. Less stable. The pressure wasn't coming from me. That's what made it effective. It came from the increasing effort required to keep stories aligned. When people get tired of maintaining contradictions, they start resenting the person who makes it necessary. That wasn't me. I didn't threaten to leave. I didn't hint at consequences. I didn't even imagine them clearly yet. Imagining too much makes you rush. I focused on keeping my own life orderly, work steady, finances clean, commitments honored. I built stability where it counted so I wouldn't need anything later. Power is easier to hold when you don't need to use it. There were moments when I could have intervened, corrected a misstatement, prevented a misstep, smoothed something over. I didn't. Intervention would have restored control to them. It would have allowed the story to reset. Instead, I let things proceed. The documentation grew heavier, not in volume, but in coherence. Patterns emerged without being named. Timelines aligned without effort. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm. That's how I knew it was working. By the time they sensed something was off, they couldn't identify where it had started. They looked for a moment of rebellion, a turning point, an argument. There wasn't one. There was just time. and attention, and the quiet weight of facts waiting to be noticed. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives already assembled, and all that's left is for everyone else to realize it's there. The setting mattered. It wasn't a living room or a restaurant this time. It wasn't private enough for revision or loud enough for chaos. It was scheduled, listed, named on a calendar that belonged to other people too. A conference room with glass walls, mid-morning light, long table, polished just enough to reflect faces without flattering them. Name cards placed with intent, a carafe of water already sweating onto coasters. This wasn't a family space. That's what made it dangerous. There were witnesses who didn't know our history and didn't need to. There were rules about time, about order, about how long anyone could speak without interruption. There were minutes being taken by someone who had no emotional investment in how the story came out, only that it made sense. I took my seat and folded my hands. I didn't bring notes. I didn't bring a folder. I didn't bring anything that looked like preparation. Across from me, my parents sat with the confidence of people who had rehearsed together. They exchanged glances, small, confirming, the kind that says we're aligned. My sister arrived last, breathless, apologetic, already framed as the one under pressure. A chair scraped, an excuse landed. It was accepted without question. The meeting began. The facilitator, a neutral third party, outlined the purpose in careful language. Clarification, alignment, resolution, words that promise progress without assigning fault. My father spoke first. He thanked everyone for their time. He acknowledged tensions. He used the word misunderstandings early and often. He framed the issue as concern. Concern about my distance, concern about communication, concern about how difficult it had become to know where I stood. He spoke smoothly, calmly. He looked reasonable. My mother followed, nodding along. She added color, emotion, but contained. "We've always tried to support," she said. "But lately it feels like we're walking on eggshells." Eggshells is a useful word when it suggests fragility without specifying cause. My sister spoke last. She didn't accuse. She didn't need to. She described how confused she felt, how blindsided, how she wished things could go back to how they were. She used my name once, carefully, as if testing it. No one interrupted her. When it was my turn, the facilitator looked at me with professional neutrality. "Would you like to respond?" I nodded. I said yes. I waited until everyone had stopped shifting in their chairs. "I don't have anything to add right now," I said. The pause that followed was brief, but charged. My mother frowned just slightly. My father leaned back. My sister looked relieved, then uncertain. The facilitator nodded and moved on. That was the first crack. The discussion continued without me. Decisions were proposed. Assumptions restated. Timelines suggested. My silence became part of the structure. It allowed them to build the narrative uninterrupted. They assumed I would correct them if something was wrong. I didn't. As the meeting went on, the story grew more detailed and less precise. Dates were mentioned, then adjusted. Conversations referenced that hadn't happened. Agreements implied that hadn't been made. Each inconsistency passed unnoticed by them. Not by everyone. The note-taker paused once, pen hovering, then wrote something down anyway. The facilitator asked for clarification on a timeline. My father answered quickly, then amended his answer mid-sentence. No one challenged him. I kept my posture relaxed, shoulders down, eyes level. I drank water when it was offered. At one point, my mother said, "We've always included them." The word always landed heavily. It's a risky word in rooms like this. The facilitator glanced at me. Just a glance. I didn't respond. The confidence across the table grew with each uninterrupted minute. Voices warmed, language softened. The narrative settled into something comfortable enough to believe. Control feels safest right before it fails. Near the end of the session, the facilitator summarized what had been said. She repeated their version carefully, neutrally. She asked if there was anything essential missing. My father smiled. I think that covers it. The room waited. I took a breath, not to steady myself, but to mark the moment. Yes, I said. There is. Every head turned, not sharply, curiously. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't change my tone. I didn't look at anyone in particular. I'm happy to clarify factual points, I continued, when it's appropriate. The facilitator nodded slowly. We can do that now. My parents exchanged a look this time that wasn't confirming. It was quick, calculating. That might not be necessary, my mother said. We're just trying to move forward. Forward is another useful word. It implies resolution without examination. I agree, I said. That's why accuracy matters. Silence returned. Different this time. Not awkward, attentive. The structure of the room shifted. Not visibly, but the rules were now active. Claims had been made. A response had been invited. Witnesses were present. Escape routes narrowed. I didn't reveal anything yet. I didn't need to. The moment wasn't about truth arriving. It was about lies realizing they'd been brought somewhere they couldn't stretch. And once that happens, everything else becomes a matter of time. The facilitator didn't rush it. She adjusted her notes, glanced at the clock, then looked up. Not at my parents, but at the far end of the table. Before we continue, she said evenly, I'd like to clarify something. The accountant spoke before anyone else could. She hadn't moved her chair. She hadn't shifted her posture. She simply opened her notebook, the same one she always used, and turned it so the page faced the center of the table. I can help with timelines, she said. Her voice was flat, professional, uninterested in drama. She didn't preface. She didn't soften. On March 12th, she continued, there was a decision made regarding shared expenses. I have the email chain confirming who was consulted and who wasn't. She paused, not for effect, but to find the page. My father leaned forward. I'm not sure that's relevant. The facilitator raised a hand, not sharply, just enough. Let her finish. The accountant nodded once and slid a printed page across the table. Not to me. Yin to the facilitator. This document shows that the decision was finalized before any message was sent to them, she said, using my name without emphasis. There's no response because there was no request. No accusation. Just sequence. The room went still in a way that felt structural, like a load-bearing beam had been removed. My mother laughed softly. That was just an oversight. The accountant didn't look up. It happened 4 times. She flipped the page. April 3rd, May 9th, June 21st. Same pattern. The facilitator skimmed quickly, then more slowly. Her pen stopped moving. My sister shifted in her seat. We were under a lot of stress, she said. Things were moving fast. Of course, the accountant replied. That's why records matter. She turned another page. There were also statements made today about inclusion, she added. I can clarify those as well. No one asked her to. At the dinner on February 14th, she said, a gift was exchanged that implied a performance-based standard. I wasn't involved in that exchange, but I was present. The wording used was... She checked her notes. You didn't earn anything this year anyway. The sentence landed without quotation marks, without commentary. My mother's face changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. That's not what I meant, she said quickly. No. the accountant replied. It's what was said. The facilitator looked up. Is that accurate? No one answered immediately. My father cleared his throat. We didn't realize it would be taken that way. The accountant closed the notebook halfway. Intent isn't documented, she said. Language is. Silence followed. Not stunned, working. In the kind of silence where people are recalculating in real time. The facilitator leaned back. I'm going to pause us here, she said, because there's a discrepancy between what's been described and what's been recorded. She looked at me then. Would you like to add anything? I shook my head. No. That was when the manager spoke. Not the restaurant manager this time, the administrative manager overseeing the meeting logistics. The one who had been quiet until now, typing notes no one had questioned. There's also a procedural issue, he said. Several decisions referenced today were presented as mutual. Our records don't reflect that. He tapped his keyboard, then rotated the screen slightly so the facilitator could see. These notes were taken contemporaneously, he added. They include attendance and consent markers. Consent markers. And the words sat there, unadorned. My parents exchanged a look that didn't finish forming. This is getting blown out of proportion, my mother said. Her voice was tight now. Controlled, but thinner. We're family. Love isn't meant for people like you. My mother said it without heat. Not anger, like she was correcting a typo. My father didn't look up. His silence landed heavier than her words. I said her name once. Not loud, not pleading, just enough to be recognized. She shook her head. Small, efficient, a refusal. My father shifted in his chair. That was his refusal. The room went dark except for the alarm clock. 2:13 a.m. The red numbers blinked like they were keeping score. On the desk, an empty medicine bottle cap lay on its side. White plastic. Harmless looking. The bottle itself wasn't there anymore. I'd thrown it out earlier. The cap stayed. My phone vibrated in my hand. Once? I didn't check it. My fingers started to shake anyway. Just enough to notice. My breath stalled. Half in, half out. Like my body forgot the next step. For a second, everything narrowed to the sound of blood in my ears. Then it stopped. I set the phone down, lined it with the edge of the desk, placed the bottle cap inside the drawer, closed it. The shaking locked itself away, obedient. Behind me, my mother exhaled, satisfied. My father finally stood up. He walked past me without contact, without a word. The door clicked shut. I stayed where I was until the clock changed to 2:14. Until the room felt ordinary again. Until whatever I'd been asking for was officially over. Much later, much more publicly, this sentence would be read aloud. By someone who wasn't related to either of them. I didn't decide anything that night. That's important. There was no vow, no heat, no internal speech about strength or survival, just a quiet understanding that whatever had happened wasn't going to be handled here. Not now. Not by me, not with words. I learned very early that timing matters more than volume. That saying the right thing too soon turns truth into noise. So I did what people mistake for weakness. I went still. Days passed, then weeks. Life continued in the way it always does after something irreversible. Emails answered, floors cleaned, birthdays acknowledged with neutral messages. No confrontation, no withdrawal dramatic enough to be noticed. They assumed that meant the moment had faded. It hadn't. It had been filed. I kept no journal. I didn't rehearse the sentence again. Repetition blunts the edge of facts. I wanted them sharp. Instead, I started paying attention to how things were recorded, how dates are logged, how statements are preserved when no one is trying to sound convincing. There is a kind of truth that doesn't need belief. It just needs to be read. I understood then that whatever resolution existed would not arrive as an apology or an admission. It would arrive as a process, forms, headers, margins that don't care who you are to each other. Nothing about it would feel personal. That was the point. When people imagine justice, they imagine exposure. Voices raised, faces caught, someone finally saying the right words. That kind of justice collapses under argument. This would not. What was coming would be boring, unemotional, unavoidable. I didn't need anyone to agree with me. I only needed something that couldn't be interrupted. There were moments when the urge surfaced, to explain, to clarify, to ask again for recognition that had already been denied. Those moments passed quickly, explaining hands power to the listener. I wasn't offering that anymore. Instead, I let time do what it does best. I let it move forward while everything stayed exactly where it was. Somewhere ahead, months, not days, there would be a table, a neutral room, a voice reading from a page. No raised tones, no chance to reinterpret intent. Just words arranged in a sequence that doesn't bend when someone shifts in their chair. I didn't know the exact date yet. I didn't need to. What mattered was certainty, not speed. That the truth would surface intact, untouched by emotion, in a form that could be witnessed without participation. I wasn't waiting for revenge. Revenge requires presence. I was waiting for something quieter, something procedural, something that, once read aloud, ends discussion. Not because anyone finally understands, but because there's nothing left to argue with. I was always the easy one. Not because I didn't want things, because I learned early how much trouble wanting caused. Wanting led to discussions. Discussions led to sighs. Sighs meant I'd misjudged my place again. So I adjusted. I didn't ask for trips. When school forms came home with optional fees circled, I erased the circles myself. I learned how to sound grateful for necessities. Shoes that fit. A jacket that zipped. Silence at the right moments. Teachers called me low maintenance. Relatives said I was mature for my age. At home, it translated cleanly, don't complicate things. I complied well. Birthdays were fine. Quiet dinners, a card, sometimes late. I never corrected dates. Dates felt like pressure. Holidays passed the same way. Pleasant enough, forgettable enough. I learned to like forgettable. Valentine's Day was never about gifts. That's the part people get wrong. I didn't expect jewelry, or flowers, or a spectacle that needed to be photographed. What I wanted was smaller, harder to measure, easier to deny. Recognition. A text that arrived without being prompted. A sentence that didn't end in a joke. A tone that said I wasn't an obligation being fulfilled out of order. I told myself it was childish to want that other people had bigger problems, that love was something you grow out of needing to see. Minimization is a skill. I got good at it. When my mother forgot to call, I told myself she was busy. When my father missed milestones, I reframed them as unimportant. I became fluent in explanations that protected everyone except me. That fluency cost less than conflict. I made it easy for them to be decent. That's what hurts the most. I didn't argue. I didn't escalate. I didn't demand apologies that would have come out thin and resentful anyway. I showed up on time. I listened. I adapted. And still, effort didn't translate to care. There's a quiet cruelty in being treated poorly despite making yourself convenient. It teaches you the wrong lesson, that if you just compress yourself a little more, you'll fit into whatever space is left. So I kept compressing. I told myself Valentine's Day wasn't real, that it was commercial, that expecting anything was embarrassing. I rehearsed indifference until it sounded natural, but indifference has weight. It settled. That night, the one with the blinking clock and the medicine cap, I wasn't asking for a gift. I was asking to be spoken to like I existed. The refusal wasn't loud. That's how I knew it was real. My mother didn't yell. She corrected me. My father didn't defend her. He removed himself. Both choices were deliberate. That mattered. I didn't retaliate. I didn't storm out. I didn't raise my voice or say anything that could be rewritten later as emotional excess. I stayed composed enough to be ignored properly. Composure is often mistaken for consent. I carried on the next day exactly as expected. Answered messages, completed tasks, returned calls with the same even tone I'd practiced for years. No one asked if I was okay. They didn't need to. I'd trained them not to. Inside, something precise clicked into place. Not despair, not anger. Alignment. The kind you feel when a long equation finally balances and you realize the answer was never flattering. The contrast became impossible to miss after that. The effort I made versus the care I received. And the silence I maintained versus the certainty with which I was dismissed. It wasn't dramatic. It was arithmetic. I had given them every opportunity to treat me gently. They chose efficiency instead. That choice stripped away any remaining doubt about my worth. Not because they affirmed it, but because their refusal no longer needed to be negotiated. Innocence doesn't mean perfection. It means clarity. I knew exactly what I had and hadn't asked for. Exactly how much I'd minimized. Exactly how little that had protected me. From that point on, I stopped shrinking. Not outwardly, internally. I didn't become difficult. I became exact. There's a difference. When someone treats you poorly after you've made yourself easy, the problem isn't misunderstanding. It's access. And access, once quietly adjusted, changes everything. Nothing changed all at once. That's how it worked. It arrived in pieces small enough to justify. Small enough to repeat without anyone noticing the pattern forming underneath. The first time, it sounded practical. "We're thinking of going away for Valentine's weekend," my mother said, standing in the kitchen, scanning a list on her phone. "Just a short trip. Logistics, really." She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't need to. My father added something about traffic, about timing, about how it made sense to leave early. They spoke like they were planning a grocery run. No invitation. No exclusion either. Just information.